Next week, on the Heckfire Club, tales of interest. The party slips beneath the streets of Tannertown into a world of whispered secrets and blood-soaked glory. The sultry Madame Yves weaves reality itself for patrons of the Silkfang Lounge. What will the voyeur's venom reveal? Strange rituals can be performed by the Brother Malkesh, fallen cleric. Will our heroes pay the price? Take in a spectacle of blood and bone among the roaring crowds. Who is the fearsome champion, crushing all would-be opponents? Don't miss Chapter 26, Beneath the Velvet Veil, next time on the Heckfire Club. Tales of interest.
Heckfire Club! Tales of interest!
We rejoin our adventurers in the presence of the Phantom, protector of the herds and guardian of the gates to the Fey and Beastlands. The plains were still visible, stretching out in golden waves beyond the fractured edges, but the ground beneath the party was no longer part of the world they knew. They stood somewhere else now, somewhere far older. The sky above roared with unnatural thunder, and the earth beneath their feet rippled with a darkness not born of shadow, but of age. They were between worlds, rivers of crimson blood flowing around them, in a place that was not meant for the living. Their bodies bore the weight of the day, deep gashes, bruises, magic frayed at the edges. Hobgoblins on wargs had nearly broken them. Bullets had nearly buried them. All in pursuit of a strange, fey-touched bison named Bessie, with 2 bright eyes and a coat like sunlit moss. And now before them towered a figure carved from storm and judgment. The Minotaur, 30 feet tall, stood in silence, his black iron horns gleaming with the fire reflected from his eyes. He did not speak, he did not move, he watched. And in that silence, broken only by the slow crackle of lightning overhead, the party understood. They were not here to answer questions. They were here to be measured. He didn't speak of debt or punishment. No, his voice, quiet and resonant, like a lone violin in the dusk. Instead, shockingly, thanked them. Bessie, the fey-touched bison they had saved from an unjust fate, was not just rare. She was sacred, a remnant of a time when the plains danced with magic, and the skies knew songs long since forgotten. The Phantom called her kin, and the adventurers, in saving her, had done more than they understood. They could name their reward. Friz spoke first, spurred by the tome of the blood rites in her pack and the staff she now wielded. She asked of blood magic and the orbs of Vestra. The Phantom weighed them again, the only movement the flicker of flames behind the void of his eyes. Blood magic, he said, had always been woven into the soil. The plains drank it. Beast and man alike had spilled too much here. It was in the air, the grass, the very marrow of the land. The oldest magics performed by mortals were born of blood. When he spoke of the orbs of Vestra, that their power, too, was born in blood. Old rituals performed by forgotten names through immeasurable sacrifice. He raised a fist in command, and thunderbolts cracked the ground before them. From the grass, earth, and ash rose a conjured scroll of impossible weight. Dominate monster. Not a spell, he warned, but a command, an arcane leash, he said, for the great beasts of the material plane. To cast the spell, a token of blood and the orb would be required. The orbs drank their essence to weave their dark magic. The eye of Vestra would drink the blood, fresh spilled, and be the conduit to the immense power of the spell. Without offering more, the Phantom claimed they would have need of it, as his eyes burned cold prophecy. They asked what else he knew of the orbs and of blood magic. He once again bore into them with his eyes. He told them to seek the Brother Malkesh at the altar of the unbound, an ancient shrine to forgotten deities beneath the city. Through sheer bravery or blind faith that took hold of our adventurers, who can say, they dared ask the Phantom one more question. They asked about Thaddeus Flint, about his blood oath with the Phantom himself, and whether the rumours were true. The Phantom, for his part, did not deny it. Thaddeus had come long ago, burning with vengeance, and the Phantom had shaped that fire into a blade. The price, said the Guardian, had not been blood, It had been order, commanded with the restoration of balance to the plains. The Phantom hadn't granted power. He had honed skill, and in exchange had demanded purpose. For the first time, the Phantom returned to them a question. Why, he asked, had they saved Bessie? The answer came quiet, unsure. Because the man who owned her was desperate, and it just felt wrong that he'd have had to toil to work off the imposed debt to the shoring up of Tanner Town. A muttered truth, raw and awkward, spoken like a confession rather than a boast. The Phantom, in his terrible and mighty form, stood as still as the unmoving mountains. Frizz jumped as lightning cracked overhead, loud as the god's own fury, his black silhouette seeming to grow even taller before them. Vanishing suddenly into mist and story, the Phantom left them with a final thought. All things returned to balance. Whether in blood or silence, the plains would remember. Reality reformed around them, the blood pulled back into the earth, the ground shifting back into soft green grass, and the sunlight returning from behind ash-grey clouds. Our adventurers stood alone, covering terrible wounds, accompanied by a giant glowing bison, and carrying a new gift from a mythic Feywild guardian, each wondering what in the world they had just survived. For a brief moment the horizon shimmered as if unsure whether to return at all. Then, like nothing had happened, the world simply resumed, as they headed back to the old rancher's modest homestead. Thomas had already launched his owl into the sky. With the storm gone, so too was whatever presence had cloaked the region in thunder and tension. He muttered something about not trusting tranquility on principle, and kept an eye on the owl's slow spiral overhead. Behind him, Frizz clutched her journal with both hands and tried desperately to write an accounting of their encounter. Ink spilled. Her quill scratched illegibly in her journal, and the cursed rhythm of her horse didn't help. Each bounce threatened to undo her script, and much as on the sandship, her stomach. Writing and riding did not agree with each other. She muttered to herself, partly in complaint, partly in determination. The moment she finally gave up and shoved the journal away, her groan was met with no sympathy whatsoever from her snickering friends. By the time the old ranch came into view, the sun had stretched long across the plains, casting a soft gold over the weather-worn fences and tall grass. Bessie spotted her home before the others had dismounted. With a sound like a boulder bellowing joy, she broke into a gallop, hooves tearing up the field in thick clumps. The rancher had just stepped out to check the sky when he spotted the blur of fur and hooves barreling toward him. There wasn't time to speak, let alone move. Bessie hit him like a furry battering ram, sending him sprawling into the dust in a tangle of limbs and laughter. She slobbered across his face like a dog greeting its long-lost owner, and he laughed loud enough to startle the birds from the roof beams. He greeted her with rough scritches and louder declarations, calling her names both endearing and exasperated. She responded with a joyful grunt and another attempt to flatten him under her weight. Bessie was sitting on him, panting like a giant purple puppy. Once he collected himself and had towelled off the bison slobber, the old ranch hand fetched something from his small smokehouse. He brought out 5 wrapped slabs of what he called giant razor beast. He held up cuts the size of halfling torsos, marbled with fat and still bearing the glint of winter's frost. He swore they'd put hair on parts of a person that didn't need it, and claimed they were best eaten during snowfall or siege. They were his second most prized possession next to Bessie. When the group offered 10 gold coins in return, he froze mid-sentence. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, in a quiet laugh that didn't quite know what to do with itself. He promised to build Bessie a pen worthy of legend, something with actual windows and windbreaks, not the patchwork nonsense he'd been hammering together before. He thanked them earnestly for the hard labour he would no longer have to do. As they made ready to leave, Bessie stepped forward, tail flicking, eyes following them. Then, slowly, her great head dipped once in their direction. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was gratitude, and perhaps something more. Considering their wounds, the ride should have been sombre, maybe even reverent, but it was Thomas's usual discomfort with silence that broke. He tossed a knowing remark at Zyrrath, asking about how happy he was to have made the right choice, the kind made without reward or fanfare. It had the cadence of a joke, but there was a nudge underneath, testing for reflection. Zyrrath didn't rise to it. He gave a stoic and infuriatingly brief response, like a mountain, choosing not to explain itself. Luck, Zyrrath said, didn't justify a single thing. Thomas rolled his eyes and groaned, the tone amused, but clearly defeated. Zora, Friz and Celia really did enjoy watching Thomas hit the proverbial wall that was Zyrrath's outer shell. The group mounted up in silence. It wasn't until the city rose on the horizon, its surrounding windmills kissed by the last amber light, that Thomas, without looking at anyone in particular, raised a question. He asked if anyone else had noticed that the boulettes hadn't gone near Bessie. Neither had the hobgoblins. No one had an answer, and no one laughed. And as the city's towers crept over the horizon, glinting in the last rays of sun, no one spoke again. The mystery clung to them like dust on their boots. There really was something about that bison. The return to Tannertown came with sore muscles and heavier thoughts. The battle for Bessie, wild, brutal, and bizarre as it had been, had left them bruised, bloodied, and more than a little bewildered. Between the boulettes, the hobgoblins, and the looming presence of the Phantom himself, the party needed two things above all: a warm meal and a long rest. As they approached the city's outskirts, the open fields outside the city's edge grown ever more crowded. Camps of out-of-towners stretched across the plains, some with ornate pavilion tents strung with flags and silks. Others little more than poles and patched cloth held together with optimism and wine. The roads pulsed with travellers, hawkers, and would-be champions drawn by the promise of gold and glory at the tourney. Inside the city proper, the bustle had only intensified. Tannertown's carefully curated sense of order still clung to the streets. But there was a new undercurrent: excitement, anticipation, and the faint tension of too many strangers brushing elbows. They made their way through the crowds to the Velvet Fang. The lobby of the sprawling stone and timber complex was ever more a blur of movement, with guests flooding every hallway and tired staff rushing to keep up. Hooded travellers bartered loudly for room keys, musicians tuned instruments by the fire, and the sound of clinking glasses echoed faintly from somewhere deep in the walls. Once again, waiting silent, elegant, and all too unsettling were the arcane sentries. The gold and silver automatons, which guarded the stairwells to the upper suites, had not for one moment relented their post. The party made their way down the familiar basement stairwell toward their modest rooms, small stone-floored quarters with a floor mat for bedrolls, decent locks, and an ever-present hint of time and mildew. But Zyrrath didn't follow. Instead, the paladin turned off at a side hall they hadn't paid attention to before. He paused just long enough to offer a curt nod and a simple good night before disappearing behind a carved wooden door, etched with elegant sigils. The others stared after him. Friz was the first to voice it, quiet disbelief that their armoured sentinel had upgraded. Thomas didn't hide his smirk, noting that someone clearly enjoyed the finer things. Celia looked half amused, half impressed. Zora, meanwhile, seemed genuinely hurt. The others settled into their rooms with less fanfare, though not without some light grumbling. Between divine oaths and radiant smites, it turned out the dragonborn paladin also liked a decent mattress. The battle-weary adventurers settled into their low-cost rooms with no discussions, no plans, just a long rest, heavy and well-earned. The city stirred before the sun had finished rising, and the party, bleary-eyed and stiff from sleep that hadn't quite been enough, found their way back to the Velvet Fang's lobby. Zyrrath was already there. He stood by the hearth, his armour scrubbed and polished to a muted gleam, each plate resting with precision, his cloak unwrinkled. He looked, maddeningly, like someone who had not only slept, but slept well. Zora stared at him for a beat too long. There was something about how refreshed the paladin looked that tugged at the fragile threads of jealousy. He didn't say anything, though, mostly because he was too busy chewing on a steaming strip of fried bread the concierge had just handed him. The plan was simple. Before heading into the underground to find the Brother Malkesh, they would go to the tourney grounds. They meant to take a look around to see if anything felt wrong. The adventurers could collectively feel it, the bank, the blood magic, the quick steel tourney. All of it was circling some unseen centre, like wolves orbiting in the shadows around a campfire. No one had said it out loud, but every step they took toward the square came with the same unspoken question. What is this really about? The city square was a rising beast since their last visit. The tournament arena had transformed. The spectator stands now reached 50 feet into the air, woven from bamboo supports and thick beams of imported wood from the southern lowlands. Ropes twisted in complex knots. Ladders leaned at impossible angles. Platforms swayed gently in the wind, not yet quite secured. No guards stopped them, no workers even looked up. They moved among carpenters, labourers, and tournament organisers without so much as a glance. The fighting platform was simple but sobering. 2 large stone circles, 30 feet apart, where combatants would face each other. The earth had been packed hard, ringed by polished stone, its centre smoothed with painstaking care. The party spread out, poking at corners, checking stonework, even measuring distances between seating and battleground. Friz ran her fingers over the chalk lines used to set the platform's bounds. Thomas knelt and rapped on the earth for hollow spaces, and Celia glanced at the sky like she expected a clue to fall out of it. Friz went so far as to cast a detect magic spell, and yet, for all their investigating, there was nothing. No runes, no sigils, no sense of dread, no scent of magic. Just dirt, stone, wood, all perfectly ordinary. And somehow that made it worse, whatever was coming. It wasn't here. Not yet. They left the grounds uneasy, tension still threading through their silence. They didn't get far before something else caught their attention. The shouting began before they could see the source. Waves of criers spilling into the market square like a sudden flood. White and blue scribe tunics moved in every direction, voices overlapping with urgency and too much choreography to be coincidence. Some were elders, others barely more than children, but all carried the same message, printed and spoken, handing our mechanically pressed leaflets. The guild was finished. One young girl stepped into their path, wide-eyed and trembling with excitement or fear. It was hard to tell which. She thrust a leaflet toward them and rattled off a rehearsed announcement with the kind of certainty that came from repetition, not understanding. The Tannertown chapter's final print. The last from any chapter, in fact. All scribes' guilds across the province were to shutter immediately. No questions, no debate. The Merchants' Council would now be speaking directly to the people. No one, it seemed, could say what that actually meant. The party exchanged looks, unspoken agreement passing between them. The news was too sudden, too clean. They had questions, and those answers would not be found in the streets. Friz asked the young girl where the Scribes' Guildhall could be found. She simply told her to follow the criers and paper flingers handing out the final print. Friz led the way, speaking in kinetic, indignant outrage about the loss of the inked word. They simply followed, knowing full well nothing short of casting Wall of Force was going to stop her. As they turned the final corner, the Guildhall was unravelling from within as they stepped into the wide-opened front doors and saw the hall full of dust and ink and panic. Scribes of every age and stripe were dragging crates and bundles through the wide hallways, arguing over scroll classifications and accidentally flinging parchment from overstuffed bags. Chaos ruled, but one voice cut through the noise, and it came from an older woman, storm-haired and sharp-voiced, standing on a toppled crate. Her spectacles swung wildly from her neck as she waved a quill like a sword and shouted something unintelligible at a trio of apprentices. hauling a precarious tower of ink pots without stoppers. She was fury in motion, and Frizz spotted her instantly. She beelined through the flurry of scribes, past clattering presses and discarded ledgers. The others followed in her wake, weaving between spilled ink and unspooled scrolls. The older woman didn't need prompting. She was already speaking to the crowd, trying to organise, already recounting what she'd pieced together in the hours since the order arrived. The decree had come sealed from Central City. Final. Irrefutable. The guilds were dissolved. Frizz asked to speak with her, and with surprising vigour she leapt off the crate. The head scribe of the Tannertown chapter had been at her post for over 20 years. Her voice cracked only once when she spoke of it, when she mentioned the cattle riots, the crows' madness, the trade routes brokered with borderland tribes. She'd written it all, preserved the truth through chaos, believing that if it was inked, it would be remembered. She had gone digging the moment the order was delivered to old contacts, speaking in quiet voices. What she found chilled her. Central City had been investing in something. Arcane research of a scale most assumed to be myth. Something about resonance channels, sigils, and amplifiers. The result was a new form of sending stones, not the small kind that fit in a palm. These were to be enormous, enchanted, and engineered to reach entire cities at once, and the council called it direct governance. The party listened, stone-faced, each weighing the implications. When the inevitable question came, what would become of the scribes, she didn't hesitate. Some would be assigned to manual labour, she said. Others would leave. A few would stay and pretend not to remember, but not all. Her voice dropped then, her eyes swept the room, and when she spoke again it was for them alone. She took Frizz by the shoulders, her grip, though ink-stained and trembling, held the weight of ritual. Some would resist, the scribe declared, quietly, carefully, and surgically. Truth, she said, did not die from absence. It died from silence, and some of them would keep speaking, even if only in whispers. When the stones go up, she said, they must look to where the shadow points 1 hour after midday. There was meaning in that phrase, not metaphor, instruction. She didn't wait for a response, and instead she turned, shouting once more at a scribe who had packed an ink press upside down and disappeared into the crowd. Her voice followed her, still bellowing, still correcting, still clinging to the last hours of the written world. The sun was still high, the streets were still loud. Before the sending stones would rise and cast their long shadows, it was time to seek the Brother Malkesh beneath the streets of Tannertown. Zyrrath led the way through the city's western edge where he'd gone exploring 2 days before. Warehouses stacked against one another, surrounded by straight but shabby shanty roofs. The noise of people and cattle thinned as they moved, not fading into silence, but something stranger. A kind of curated stillness. There were no guards, no beggars, no scrawls on the walls, no petty squabbles in the alleys. Just the quiet rustle of wind through dry cloth, and the creak of sun-bleached signs. Thomas muttered something under his breath about the slums in Saffron Sands, about the guards there and their shakedown of the poorer quarters. Tannertown was under the assumed control of Thaddeus Flint, and yet no beggars, no garbage, not a sign of anything. They rounded the final corner, and there he was, a lone sentry leaning against a stack of crates, completely carefree. He didn't reach for a weapon or call for backup, just cocked his head as they approached and asked if they were hungry for something. The password, brisket, passed along by the retired baron-turned-gambler over dinner at the Velvet Fang, earned a subtle smile from the leaning man. The sentry nodded as if that was exactly what he'd been hoping to hear. He banged twice on the side of the crate stack. There was a hollow knock, then the groan of concealed hinges as the crates folded inward to reveal a dark staircase well lit by colourful magical lanterns. The sentry handed them a map, actual parchment magically inked with movement and layers. It would only be read through magic or under the coloured arcane lanterns of the underground. It became apparent to the group that this wasn't a speakeasy or some smuggler's bolt hole. Inside, the stairwell, neat carved and well lit, revealed itself. They could hear music from 5 different corners, drifting down twisting cavernous causeways. neon spells humming through enchanted banners, taverns built into old catacombs, card dens and fortune parlours shoulder to shoulder beneath painted canopies. Illusory signs pulsed with directions. This was a city beneath the city, and full of people moving about, spectators and participants and travellers from all over the province. Thomas looked like a child on his first trip to a cursed candy shop. Friz gripped her cloak a little tighter, muttering calculations about how many exit points she could reach in under 10 seconds. As any good group of adventurers, they would start in a tavern to gather rumours and information before finding the altar of the unbound and the strange priest. Friz admitted with the edge of a grin that the glowing path system and animated map were a clever layering of dancing lights, silent image, and probably illusory script. They read over the map together, plotting a course through the massive underground complex. Their fingers traced over half a dozen smaller taverns but settled on one that pulsed with a different sort of energy. The Drowned Lyre, its sign on the map, the shape of a broken harp. When they inquired to passers-by and shop-stall merchants, they were told that bards of the College of Secrets claimed the Drowned Lyre as their own. Friz scanned the crowd and did the numbers in her head. At least 2,000 people moved through these halls. Traders, gamblers, masked dancers, bruised-fisted brawlers, and starry-eyed thrill-seekers from above-ground noble houses, looking for danger without consequences. It was everything Tannertown wasn't. Down here no one batted an eye. The party didn't stand out, not among the veiled courtiers, silver-masked revellers, or the heavily cloaked figures drifting from parlour to parlour. Even Zyrrath's towering frame drew only one or two raised brows. A surface anomaly, not a threat. Thomas walked with hands tucked conspicuously into his pockets. Not out of modesty, but restraint. There were too many purses dangling at the perfect height, too many rings worn by people far too distracted. He glanced at a heavy pouch bouncing on a halfling's belt and smirked, then turned away. A small victory. He was growing, he insisted. Celia, walking beside him, quipped that true maturity would be when he stopped thinking of pickpocketing entirely. That real growth, enlightenment as she put it, meant not having the thought at all. Celia walked serenely forward, smirking and satisfied with the jab, true as it was. Thomas raised an eyebrow and asked sheepishly if she was a monk or something. That earned a brief ripple of laughter from the group, brief because Zyrrath had stopped walking. No words at first, just stillness. Then he looked to Celia, voice low and urgent, and told her to follow the couple, turning the corner up ahead. The adventurers saw an older pair, white-haired and well-dressed, moving without haste and looking around at the people, lights and shops. As he watched the last glimpse of their silhouettes vanish into the curve of the alleyway, Zyrrath whispered to them that the woman was wearing the flag of his people across her back. Not a pattern, not a coincidence, but the flag itself. The others exchanged glances, reading what wasn't being said. Zora's fingers curled around his belt. Thomas exhaled. Friz's brows furrowed behind her lenses. Celia had already vanished into the crowd, graceful, fast, and weaving like a dancer through the press of bodies. The rest of them stayed back with Zyrrath, who remained stiff and unmoving. His eyes locked on the corner, his whole form coiled. Not for violence, not yet, but for something, for once, deeply personal. Celia had herself made it to the corner, and now they waited. The couple was just ahead of Celia now, their pace slow and unbothered. She caught up with them near a glowing street lantern shaped like a whale's eye, casting shimmering waves of blue across the cobblestones. The woman was all sparkle and stories, cloaked in rich sable and the kind of self-appointed glamour only age and coin could earn. Gertie, as her husband had just called her, asking her not to stray too far away, was absolutely delighted at the colourful and strange wonders around her. She lit up the moment Celia introduced herself, delighted at the notion of meeting a real monk. She clutched her husband's arm, Bertram, with theatrical enthusiasm, and confessed that she'd never met a monk in Westport, and wasn't that just marvellous, Gertie asked her husband Bertram. Bertram, stoop-shouldered, quiet, and visibly overwhelmed by the chaos of the underground, nodded slowly while clutching his coin purse like it was a sacred relic. His eyes darted to a man across the walkway who wasn't even looking at him. "Yes, dear," he murmured half to himself. Celia commented on the woman's cloak, noting the curious symbol emblazoned on its back. Gertie's face lit again, delighted by the attention. She explained that it was real sable, not enchanted mimic fur, mind you, but the genuine article, a retirement gift from herself to herself. She'd spent her whole life on the Westport coast, and now that the sun had set on their working days, she'd told Bertram that it was high time for a bit of fun. A tawny trip to the east seemed just the thing. Bertram, wide-eyed at a nearby mime performance and clearly out of his element, agreed with his signature line. "Yes, of course, dear," before sidestepping away in fear from a reveller who hadn't even acknowledged him. When Celia circled back to the flag, the stylized crest woven into the fur lining, Gertie beamed like a merchant showing off a rare gem. She'd picked it up in the dockyard market, she said, from a booth filled with exotic wares. Apparently, a fleet of ships from foreign continents had docked months ago, and ever since, the markets had swelled with colours and patterns from strange lands. Celia reflexively offered to buy it. She wasn't about to take it from the sweet old woman. And just like that, the warmth drained from Gertie's face. The twinkle stayed, but behind her eyes something older flickered, an edge honed by decades of haggling and precisely zero patience for being underestimated. Her tone shifted as she tilted her head and asked, not unkindly, just very deliberately, how much gold a monk could possibly be carrying. Surely Celia must live an ascetic life. Wasn't that the whole point? Inner peace and outer poverty. She held the cloak tighter around her shoulders. It was to her, apparently, exotic, sentimental, and exceedingly rare. And from the way she said rare, Celia could feel the price climbing. She billowed the cloak, going on theatrically about how she was very proud of it. "She loved it dearly, didn't she?" said Gertie to her sweet Bertram. Bertram, who had not let go of his coin purse once since the conversation began, nodded solemnly, saying a flat, "Very much, dear," his eyes still darting on every stranger within 10 feet of him. And if Celia didn't know better, she might have missed the way his grip tightened again, as if the pouch itself might bolt for safety. Celia sensed she wasn't going to win this particular duel of words, and Bertram would be the first to scream bloody murder at the first sign of trouble. Instead, Celia pressed the old woman for all she knew of the merchants and wares at Westport, and returned to her friends. As she walked back, she could hear Gertie exclaim that it was time for a palm reading from "that strange fellow with the mask." She didn't have to hear Bertram's voice to know the response. Some duels, thought Celia, were lost before they started. Celia returned to the group with news. Details about a merchant market in Westport, foreign ships, and the woman's proud acquisition of what she thought was simply a unique design. Zyrrath listened in silence, then said what he needed to say with no embellishment. He would need to go west, and soon. Zora, without hesitation or drama, made the correction, saying plainly that they would go west together. Zyrrath didn't argue, he simply nodded. Nothing more was said about the flag. Not its meaning, not its origin. But it stayed between them, humming beneath the surface like a string pulled taut across time. Ahead, the causeway gave way to docks, wooden walkways suspended above a massive subterranean lake. The water shimmered with soft magic, and above it, dozens of instruments floated mid-air. Flutes, lutes, harps and pipes, all playing an unbroken wandering melody that rose and fell like a tide of memory. The Drowned Lyre wasn't a tavern in the usual sense. Its platforms were wide barges lashed together with rope, and patrons could float out to the centre of the cavern, lanterns in hand, to trade whispers and stories. Tonight, however, nearly every barge had drifted inward, jammed together into one loud, swaying island. The music had crescendoed into something bolder. The crowd was electric, At the centre, atop a wide table with boots planted and arms flailing in dramatic recounting, stood a woman with hair like a brushstroke split in two, salt white and blood red. They'd seen her face plastered on banners from the Inkwell to Great Eye Lake and back to Tannertown. Before an enthralled crowd was Blondie, the monster slayer out of Nettleport. She was mid-sentence, spinning a tale of her last hunt, while the gathered bards around her, dozens of them, scrambled to transcribe, harmonise, or dramatise every flourish. Quills scratched, strings plucked, and slack-jawed bards chorused in ooh and ahs at Blondie's retelling. For half a beat she paused and eyed the adventurers as her hand reached for her breast pocket. She went right back to her tale almost immediately. The story they came here for was waiting, even if it wasn't the one they expected. Blondie raised her tankard, the picture of charging cavalry, foam sloshing over her knuckles as the gathered bards around her fell into reverent, breathless silence. She described the storm, clouds black with old rage, lightning that struck to kill. She and her crew had chased the rumours for 17 weeks straight, following tales from dockhands too drunk to walk and sailors too mad to lie. The name they chased was always the same, the Silver Aboleth. A few bards trembled audibly at the name. One scribbled it in oversized letters on his sheet music, with such flair his inkwell tipped over. Another whispered it under his breath, asking no one what even rhymed with Aboleth. Blondie continued. Her ship, the Maiden's Grudge, was a thing of legends. Ghostwood hull, heartwood bolts, faster than a swordfish. It had outrun krakens, slipped through reaver nets, even outmanoeuvred a Leviathan cult that had tried to draft her as a holy martyr. Shrieks and gasps from the bards echoed against the ceiling. The storm had brought them to a crescent cove under starlight, quiet. Still. Too still. That's when the audience leaned in again, like plants toward a sunbeam made of dread. She said the beast rose slow, silver-scaled, swaying, moon-eyed, and sang. That was the word that cracked the room. The bloody thing sang. One bard dropped her quill in shock, another clutched their tambourine like a holy relic. Gasps echoed like waves, and one particularly fragile poet in the front row nearly fainted when Blondie explained that half her crew leapt overboard mid-hymn, screaming and flailing under the Aboleth's spell, pulled under and drowned. She spoke of the fight, daggers driven into eyes that healed with mist instead of blood, a creature that didn't die so much as pause. In its final thrash, the Silver Aboleth shattered her ship like cheap pottery. She had woken alone, clinging to a splinter of helm, drifting in silence. How she returned, she said with a grin that had too many teeth and too many memories, was a story for another time. She drained her tankard with the flair of a pirate queen, slammed it to the table, and declared her intent to meet the creature again. Only next time, she'd bring sharper steel, adding a dramatic pause and twice the rage. Focusing on something unseen at the back of the room, her face dropped into seriousness. From her blue coat, she pulled out a bottle, and gone was the mirth of Blondie. She spoke softly, uncorking the rum, and raised it to her lost crew, mighty men and women, every one of them. Blondie drank. Deeper and deeper she pulled on the bottle, not stopping until she saw the bottom, bolstered on by the boisterous bards. The master hunter, leaning further back with every chug, gave the crowd a final quenched gasp, and fell straight back into the water with an audible splash. The bards erupted as a dozen lutes struck up simultaneously, none in the same key. Someone with a pan flute began tootling what might have been a battle anthem. The bards were all slacking their barges away from each other, each determined to be first to write the latest epic of the sea. Two rival bards argued mid-chord over whether it was better to open with Silver Song of the Sea or Maiden's Grudge Laments. Overhead, enchanted instruments joined in uninvited, trying to harmonise with the madness and only making it worse. A floating trumpet fired off a fanfare with no cue and refused to stop. The barges wobbled as bodies leapt from one to the next, chasing inspiration or better acoustics. The water below rippled violently, and at least one dwarven bard lost their footing, and fell overboard of their barge. Our adventurers eyed the scene before them, thinking in unison that bards really could be a silly folk. Somewhere beneath all that noise, Blondie floated, her glazed-over eyes staring at the top of the cavern. Frizz thought it might be a good idea to pull her out of the water. It was Zora who spotted her, floating just off the side of a nearby barge, face up and mumbling about coins and pockets. He hauled her out of the water with a grunt, muttering something under his breath as she coughed once and kept muttering. She was thoroughly soaked and unmistakably drunk, if not altogether unconscious. The party needed her alert, preferably upright. They tied off their barge and pulled it toward the docks, nudging past a few clustered boats on the way. At the landing stood the tavern's proprietor, an aging elf with sharp features and a silver-stringed lyre slung across his back. He introduced himself with a flourish as Cyrillus Nam, though he claimed most called him Sweet Sid of the Lyre. From the way he said it, the party suspected he was the only one who did. Sid barked at a nearby apprentice to pour drinks for their guests, then turned his attention to Zyrrath. He seemed unusually interested, declaring this was his first dragonkin. He winked. Zyrrath responded with an unreadable stare. If the moment was awkward, no one said so. Unfazed, Sid welcomed them to the Drowned Lyre. When the group asked if there was a way to wake Blondie, Sid shouted again, this time for something called rooster juice. The apprentice donned leather gloves and glass goggles, nodded grimly, and began mixing a series of pungent liquids and ground spices, his expression somewhere between duty and dread. The concoction smelled terrible. As the apprentice carefully poured viscous green liquid into a tall mug while pinching his nose shut, Sweet Sid leaned in with the air of a man about to share something very important. He explained that the brew was custom-made for him by none other than the original Grosnak himself. The party exchanged a few nods. They'd shopped at Grosnak and Company before. Sid immediately waved that away, not the shopfront knockoffs above ground. No, this was true Grosnak. His real work, only available down here in the underground, brewed in secret with ingredients not strictly legal or fully named. This piqued the party's interest, though not enough to get too close to the mug. After some persuading, Sid told them they could find the alchemist's lab behind the fourth cart at the Cindervale Market, under the first sewer grate. Couldn't miss it. He added proudly that he'd secured the recipe in exchange for providing Grosnak with the exclusive Bard's jingle to market the stuff. Before the party could react, Sid asked if they'd heard it, and without warning, a dozen bards across the lyre lifted their voices in flawless, overly rehearsed harmony.
Grosnak's cheapest in the land. Pop the stopper.
The party stood in
and
silence,
gobble
enduring
the
it.
brew.
1 or 2 bards were incorrigible. A whole tavern full, however, lacked the basic human ability to shut up. The bottle handed over by the attendant with rather careful concern for his own safety, boiled and bubbled, and the contents seemed to want to crawl out of the vial on its own. Zora shrugged, pinched the pirate's nose, and gave it to Blondie anyway. What followed was immediate, a sputter, a growl, a guttural yell of rage as Blondie sat up, drew 2 shark-toothed daggers, quick as a snake, and was ready to kill. Her eyes refocused, and her voice returned in a guttural rasp, somewhere between a greeting and a threat. She inhaled deeply, her eyes opening wide, and the look on her face changing to something bordering between elation and intoxication. Whatever rooster juice was, it was strong. She stared at the group, still clutching something tightly in her coat pocket. After a beat, she asked who they were, and what, exactly, had warranted being pulled from what she considered a very important nap. In broken cadence, speaking one after another, our adventurers told her about the tourney, their intent to compete, their arrival in Tannertown. It flowed from them one by one. She listened, her attention sharpening with every word. She called them brave, but felt their story was really a tragedy as, with a smirk, she said the prize money would soon be hers anyway. If they had been listening at all, said Blondie, it so happened that she needed a new ship, which weren't cheap. But her hand never left her pocket. Then came the question, flat and casual. She asked if any of them by chance were carrying cursed coins. No one answered immediately, yet the tone of the conversation had clearly changed, and Zora met Zyrrath's eyes. The rooster juice had done its job, possibly too well. Blondie sat upright, fully lucid, if not fully sober, eyes cutting sharper than her reputation. Without a word, she slipped a coin from a hidden pocket in her weather-beaten jerkin and held it up to the lantern light. The party recognized it instantly, skull on one side, a blazing sun on the other. It hummed with an arcane pull that none of them liked. Blondie said she'd felt it ring the moment they entered. The coins, she mused, wanted company. She asked if they'd used theirs, flipped it in a desperate moment, trusted it to turn fortune in their favour or lead them one step closer to a grave. Zyrrath answered her with a nod. She returned it without comment. The shared weight between them said enough. Blondie's coin, she explained, had belonged to a reaver. Had, being the operative word. She didn't linger on the details. The man had lost the coin, and everything else that mattered, when she took it. But before he went down, he'd shared something strange, a scrap of a ritual, a piece of knowledge passed down in the circles where curses were currency. The coins, she said, were linked to an old legend, the curse of legendary pirate Commodore Balthazar. After a fatal mutiny with his dying breath, the Commodore cursed the coins, so his dreaded mutineers could never revel in his fabled buried golden hoards. She leaned in then, her voice a notch lower, and told them plainly, "Cleanse the coin, and you don't just lose the curse. You make it into true coinage for the ferryman. A second chance. A way to pay death," she said, to look the other way. The idea lingered, heavy and irresistible, but the ritual wasn't simple. She needed more coins. And, judging by the group in front of her, she might not be able to just kill for them this time. With a grin, she told them what came next. First, she'd need a ship, she said, and she supposed that in this case some more coin carriers. Winning the tournament would give her both, and if she didn't win, and if death didn't take her first, well, she'd be glad to bring them aboard. She promised them those that sailed with her would get to see things few in the world ever could, and the chance of finding wonders lost and ancient. The idea of strange wonders out on the open sea for Friz almost made her forget her rather unpleasant ride aboard Rowland's dune skipper ship. Blondie, as she put it, wasn't the kind to ask for help. What she offered them instead was a seat with her on the storm she'd rage. Her cleansed coin, she said, she would need to avenge her crew against the aboleth. As they pondered for half a heartbeat, Blondie reached into her pack and declared, boldly, that they had rudely interrupted her nap. And she, being practical, would spear 2 fish with 1 harpoon. Blondie produced a finely labelled bottle of Golden Sun's rye whiskey and declared to the drylanders before her that one of them would need to take a soak and not drown first. She set it down on the table with a grin that promised suffering and called it a test of mettle. Zora was already sitting before anyone could object. The rest of the party exchanged looks ranging from concern to resignation. Friz made a vague gesture toward the bottle, then toward Zora, as if highlighting the inevitability of disaster. Celia, arms crossed, looked ready to intervene, until Zora leaned back in his chair, expression calm, almost serene. She sighed instead, and let him make his choices. Zyrrath declined the contest and told her plainly that he had nothing to prove to her. Thomas watched with something dangerously close to enthusiasm. He'd seen wagers this stupid before. He usually wasn't on the sober side of them. He bet a bard a gold piece on his large friend, which the naive young bard took. The first few drinks went smoothly. It really was quite good. Zora didn't flinch. Blondie didn't blink. A few of the bards floated closer, sensing a new epic in the making. By the third round, one bard began humming a tune and jotting down possible titles. Another suggested, "The Pirate and the Whale at Drink." It was immediately picked up. Zora began to sweat. Blondie began to ramble about anchor ropes and ghosts with gambling debts. Neither showed signs of surrender. The bottle reached its end. They stood, wobbled. Blondie raised her arms in triumph. Zora tried to clap, but missed. It looked like a draw. Blondie took a bow to the cheering crowd, blinked once, and rose a touch too quickly as her own momentum toppled her backward. No one moved. Then, for the second time in less than an hour, the salt-haired pirate took a dip. Bards rushed to the edge, peering down as Blondie floated peacefully, arms out, snoring gently. Thomas made a note that it was perhaps the most dignified end to a drinking contest he'd ever seen. Frizz muttered something about barge safety regulations. Celia didn't say a word, just looked to Zora, who appeared confused as to whether he'd won or merely survived. Zora was not in his more regal state, but Sweet Sid was already tasking his attendant with mixing a fresh batch of rooster juice. The adventurers looked at Zyrrath. For a moment he was confused, but quickly understood and, resigned, held down the freshly malleable barbarian and pinched his nose. Zyrrath warned those around that any especially destructible bards may want to step back. The walk away from the drowned lyre was unusually energetic. Zora led the way, bounding forward with a spring in his step, and the kind of breathless commentary usually reserved for the very bards at the lyre. He declared to no one in particular that he felt amazing. His sinuses had never been clearer, his throat was quenched, and he was fairly certain he could lift 1,000 oxen. Possibly stacked. Thomas quietly suggested they keep him away from any livestock just in case. Celia, walking behind him, gave a sidelong glance to Frizz. Neither spoke, but there was clear agreement. Zora's cheer was suspicious. Whatever was in the rooster juice had clearly bypassed his stomach and gone straight to his bloodstream. Frizz quietly noted that euphoria was not a common side effect of whiskey and boiled herbs, unless something was seriously off-script. Celia agreed. Zyrrath naturally said nothing, but even he kept one hand resting on his hilt as Zora praised the taste of stone walls and debated whether or not he could punch a mountain. They followed the arcane-lit trail deeper through the lower causeways, eventually arriving at a wide, yawning archway carved into the stone like the mouth of something ancient. Beyond it stretched a massive cavern, easily 3 times the size of the Liar's Lake, and filled to the brim with stalls, booths, tents, and makeshift counters. The Cinder Vale market buzzed with activity, and not the friendly kind. A haze of incense, smoke, and something vaguely metallic drifted in the air. Lanterns flickered above fabric awnings, and enchanted signs blinked in mismatched colours. The smell of sweet fried dough clashed violently with some kind of spiced eel jerky roasting nearby. Merchants shouted over one another, offering rare potions, charmed cookware, illusionary pets, and something wholly unnatural in a cage. Shoppers haggled with a zeal that bordered on combat. One large sign read, "No incineration inside the market." A goblin in a velvet waistcoat screamed of unfair pricing while being escorted out by a pair of animated coat racks. The party took it all in. Frizz adjusted her cloak tighter. Celia kept to the edge of the footpaths. Thomas looked visibly tempted to get involved in at least 3 scams before thinking better of it. Zyrrath simply walked like a statue moving through chaos, untouched and unbothered. Zora, still positively radiant with false vitality, inhaled deeply and announced he could live here. When the party looked at him, he was eating something freshly charred and completely unidentifiable. No one responded. Not because they disagreed, just because they weren't entirely sure he hadn't already set up a tent somewhere off the main thoroughfare. They had a new direction now, the secret shared by Sweet Sid, of a hidden shop past the 4th cart on the left and behind the sewer grate. They would find Groznak's, another quick stop before getting to the altar of the Brother Malkesh, and see what else he might have other than rooster juice. They were nearly there. The 4th stall, the sewer grate, the path to Groznak's real home brews, exactly what they'd come down here for. But just before they reached it, Thomas slowed. A storefront caught his eye, the sticky finger wares, and he turned confidently toward it without a word. The rest followed, not out of agreement, but out of habit. Something else, once again, had veered the adventurers from their intended path. The shop was quiet and dim, and the shelves were lined with scrolls and minor magical oddities. The shopkeeper, masked and nameless, greeted them with an even tone. It wasn't hostile, but it lacked warmth. Unprompted, the shopkeeper assured them that everything was for testing and academic experimentation only. No one challenged him. It still rang hollow. Frizz's gaze swept over the scrolls and she said nothing, though her posture shifted. Invisibility. Pass without trace. Knock. Suggestion. These weren't spells taught for utility or exploration. These were spells used when one wanted access, silence, or influence, preferably without being noticed. The spells and items on hand practically represented the list of banned arcana from the codebook of maestras. She turned the owl signet ring inward on her hand, reflexively, to avoid the wrong kind of attention. Thomas made a brief study of the price tags. His reaction was immediate and unimpressed. The scrolls and items were expensive, more than expected. To Zora, Frizz, Celia, and Zyrrath, Thomas was simply taking his usual haggling posture of indignant robbery. The shopkeeper didn't flinch. Customers, he said, usually found the results, letting the word hang for a moment, to be more than worth the cost. No one argued the point. The truth was that their coin was running low. The last job in the Darkwood had stretched thin, and Tannertown had not been cheap. They were beginning to feel it. They left without buying anything, but not without consideration. Some of those spells might be necessary, especially if breaking into the Velvet Suites was on the horizon. The sticky finger wares, questionable as it was, might end up being useful. At long last they found the great. No more diversions, no curious shops, no singing bards, and no lectures about scroll pricing. It had taken longer than expected, but the distractions had begun to feel less like accidents and more like deliberate parts of the design. In the underground, staying on task was a challenge, and they were starting to understand that was the point. Zora gripped the iron bars and pulled, and the grate gave a long, echoing creak that would have drawn a dozen eyes in any normal city. Here, not a single head turned. In the Cinder Vale market, slipping into a sewer was apparently not at all noteworthy. They stepped into the dark and moved quickly down the narrow causeway, their boots clicking against stones slick with moisture and alchemical runoff. The path curved, and around the corner, a soft glow spilled from an open archway that pulsed with warm light and an odd chemical tang. What they found was technically an alchemy lab, though none of them would accuse it of professionalism. The space was cramped and hot, filled with copper bathtubs, scorched work tables, and mismatched barrels arranged without label or logic. Vials, bottles, and jars lined the walls, and their contents ranged from potent reagents to unidentifiable substances that pulsed or floated, some of which were still moving. Celia scanned the space, recognizing many ingredients from her training, though several were unknown to her, and a few were plainly not part of any standard alchemical catalogue. One jar contained what looked like a frog's tongue wrapped around a glowing shard, while another emitted a faint hum every few seconds as if displeased to be ignored. In the centre of the room, standing inside a massive copper tub filled with swirling fuchsia liquid, stood Groznak himself. His boots were tall, and his leather apron long, stained with streaks of green, blue, and something smoking with luminescence. He wore thick gloves and stirred the mixture with slow, deliberate movements, as bubbles floated up in hues of sickly green and pale yellow. He looked up as they entered, and his grin spread across his face, as if greeting familiar friends. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and warm, the tone oddly soothing, as though they had just wandered into a quiet bakery, and not a bubbling workshop full of dangerous substances and likely violations of magical safety laws. Whether that made him more or less alarming was still up for debate. Groznak admitted in that same tea-shop tone that he didn't usually sell direct to customers, but here they were. With a theatrical wave of his stirring stick, he gestured to a wall-mounted chalkboard that listed his current experimental offerings. The potions were familiar in theory: potion of giant strength, water breathing, mind shielding, but each came with notes, diagrams, and what Frizz immediately recognized as unsettling side effects. The water-breathing draft, for instance, did indeed allow the user to breathe underwater for an hour. It also, in large red script, noted that the drinker would be unable to breathe air for the same duration, which was not ideal unless one was already submerged. Zyrrath, reading the fine print, observed that such a feature might make for a useful interrogation tool if one were to force-feed it to the right individual. Grosnak looked genuinely appalled at the suggestion. He clutched his stirring rod like a pearl-clutching aunt, though it was difficult to tell if it was moral disapproval or concern someone had beaten him to the idea. Prices were low and the selection was charitably unique, but gold was still gold, and the party didn't have much of it. They began to turn, with Thomas muttering that the surface Grosnaks were cheaper. That made Grosnak panic, and he leaned halfway out of the tub, arms flailing, insisting they not trust his franchisees. According to him, the surface-level shops had been cutting corners, diluting brews, and replacing critical ingredients with whatever was on hand. His good name, he insisted, was being dragged through the muck. The party looked around at the stained floors, half-labelled jars, and one shelf that was definitely on fire. It was unclear what good name he was referring to exactly. Still, Grosnak pressed on. He said he needed help, specifically their help. They looked well-travelled, and his new contracts needed delivery. Each major city in the province had a licensed Grosnak location, and he needed them to carry revised agreements that would guarantee adherence to the real formula. Grosnak explained that each franchisee carried a mandatory gold reserve of 1,000 gold, per their current contract stipulations. Should they deliver the document, they should get the payment. He did warn in earnest that some less than respectable merchants may refuse to sign. That, he said, would be unfortunate. Zyrrath assured him it wouldn't be a problem. Grosnak accepted that answer without further clarification. The group agreed that eventually, once they'd found more gold, probably after the tourney, they'd pick up some of the more choice items on Grosnak's list. Grosnak beamed, the kind of grin that stretched too far and showed slightly too many teeth. He suggested 2 ways to solve their gold shortage quickly: the Rusted Crown Casino, or for a group of their obvious talents, the Broken Chain Arena. They thanked him, and as they stepped back into the tunnel leading away from the lab, the familiar pattern returned. The underground had pulled them off course again. With Grosnak's promise of payment echoing behind them and coin now firmly back at the top of their priorities, the party took out their maps and marked the nearest lead: the Broken Chain Arena. It was closer than the casino, and likely more aligned with their particular skill set. The crowds confirmed they weren't alone in that choice, and as they followed the route through the Cindervale's winding passages, the flow of people grew heavier. Dozens of smaller tunnels fed into the main thoroughfare, each lined with lanterns and signs in dozens of languages. Most of them read the same thing: this way to glory. Others were less optimistic. Frizz noted how few people were heading in the opposite direction. That kind of crowd movement only meant the show likely hadn't started yet. The corridors opened into a massive antechamber with high ceilings and glowing waypoints directing the traffic. Arched walkways led off to upper and lower tiers, each level stacked with seats and box balconies. Frizz gave it a glance and estimated the arena could easily seat over 1,000. It was, all things considered, very well organised. They reached the front of a queue leading to a set of ticket booths, where masked attendants processed the line with brisk efficiency. When their turn came, the attendant, dull-eyed but alert, asked them for payment. Before the others could respond, Zora stepped forward and said they weren't here to watch, but instead were here to fight. The attendant blinked once, then perked up, suddenly very interested in the people before him. He stepped from the booth and waved them through a side entrance with a kind of half-formality, already scribbling their names on a slate as he walked. They followed him into a quieter, narrower hall. He introduced himself as Marlin and asked the usual questions: names, background, next of kin. The sort of inquiries that suggested things inside the arena didn't always end in applause. When he finished, he offered them a polite nod and asked for their patience. Then he turned and walked to the far end of the corridor, where a single reinforced door stood under an enchanted light. He paused. They watched him take a deep breath. He adjusted his collar, knocked once, hesitated, and then knocked again, slower. The voice that answered was muffled, low, and immediately terrifying. The attendant flinched as whatever came next the party now understood. This was the beginning of the real arena. The voice that answered the attendant's knock didn't belong to a clerk or administrator. It rolled like thunder down the corridor, followed by the unmistakable crash of something heavy, likely a mace, colliding with something unfortunate. The attendant flinched, but the door opened before he could knock again. Ulma Irontooth didn't simply enter the room, she claimed it. Short, broad, and carved from oak, she strode forward with every inch the authority she commanded. She took in the party's expressions, read the flickers of hesitation, and offered a greeting as blunt as a warhammer. They looked confused, and she'd expected as much. Zora tried to speak, but before he could, Ulma was already going again. She introduced herself as Ulma Irontooth, 13 years undefeated in the Broken Chain arena, and now the arena's owner, thanks to a final match against her mentor that ended with blood, bruises, and the transfer of keys. Celia, Friz, and Thomas took a turn at trying to sign up for the fights, and yet she was unflappable. The tale of the trio of scars on her cheek and the dying wish of a mentor and fighter who believed no one should own a ring they couldn't die in flowed out of her. Her voice dropped briefly as she traced the scars, recalling the death she'd given, and the one she'd earned in return. Zyrrath thought better of interjecting and simply let Ulma tire herself of her verbal offensive. Hard as a hammer strike, she surged back to full volume as she demanded to know what in the hells they wanted. They answered, somewhat in awe at her, that they were here to fight. Ulma's grin split wide, asking why they hadn't mentioned that sooner. She outlined the gauntlet, a multi-stage trial designed to test more than combat. Each round could be a battle, a feat of strength, or something more psychological, and all were designed to push contenders to their limit. The pay increased with each round, 250 gold, then 500, then 1,000, and so on. But she made one detail perfectly clear. They could die. The choice to yield or fall was theirs. She gestured to Marlin, the clipboard-clutching elf nearby, and shouted for him to handle registration. He leapt to attention and approached with the energy of someone trying to keep both his shoes and his life. The party signed. But they hadn't just come for the gauntlet, they asked to also challenge the champion. Ulma laughed, a deep cracking sound that bounced off the stone walls. Of course they did. Either they were brave or profoundly mistaken, and she wasn't sure which she preferred. The champion had gone undefeated for 4 months, leaving a trail of cracked ribs, splintered teeth, and hopefuls turned cautionary tales. The challenge required a 500 gold stake, she told them, but if they won, they'd walk away, 10-fold richer. If they lost, well, she shrugged. That would be between them and whatever deity was taking appointments that day. She looked toward Marlin and asked how many times she'd said that today. He replied, quietly, that this made 7. Ulma seemed satisfied with that. Ulma wasted no time. With a bark that echoed like cannon fire, she ordered Marlin to give the contestants a tour. She spun on her heel and shouted something else toward a figure who had apparently been waiting in her office the entire time. There was no apology from Ulma, just more volume. The crowd could be heard above now, pouring into the arena stands, boots on stone, laughter, and the distant beat of drums meant to excite rather than soothe. The show was beginning, even if their part wouldn't start for a few more hours. Marlin, still visibly recovering from his earlier interaction with Ulma, led them through the stone hall that served as the contestants' corridor. At the far end, past lockers, weapon racks, and a shrine to several competing gods of chance and violence, he gestured toward the preparation chambers. That, he said, was where they'd wait and ready themselves for their match 2 hours from now. So, as they walked, he let slip that there were odds, of course, and it so happened the Rusted Crown Casino, conveniently nearby, handled all bets placed on the arena bouts. Contestants could place bets too, but only on themselves, and only to win. The party exchanged glances. None of them said it outright, but the pattern was becoming clear. The underground didn't just offer options, it created them, connected them, looped them, and fed them back into each other. One venue led to another. One opportunity unlocked the next. And every path involved coin. Marlin, still fidgeting and damp with nerves, gave a brief awkward bow and excused himself with nervous politeness. With little time and even less gold, the group made their way to the Rusted Crown. Zyrrath, as they walked, commented that the dead, it seemed to him, had no use for coin. No one argued. It was simple, grim, and very much in character. And with that subtle brand of optimism only this particular brand of paladin could deliver, they agreed. They would double down on themselves. The walk to the Rusted Crown Casino was lined with every kind of face the underground had to offer. Some strolled toward the entrance with wide grins, arms draped around companions or clutching strings of gold-marked chips. Others staggered away, pale and wide-eyed, their purses emptied, their pride limping behind them. Outside the tall archways, a troop of tiefling men and women, each barely dressed, each strikingly symmetrical, passed out colourful drinks in twisting glasses with names no one could pronounce. The casino's interior was levels and halls, stages and bards and acrobats, and most importantly, rows and rows of card, dice, and tumbler tables. The adventurers made note of a well-guarded door at the back, where 2 rather large half-orcs and a muscular tiefling matron were standing watch. Thomas elbowed Zora and pointed to it, calling it the money room where high-stakes games were being played. At the concierge desk stood a wiry man with sharp features, a crooked smile, and only 3 fingers on his right hand. The nameplate in front of him read Jackson, though the nickname scribbled beneath it. 3 fingers. Told the story Thomas knew well. That wound came from trying to cheat the wrong table. He suspected Jackson was working off a debt, the slow, painful way. With a nod and no unnecessary questions, Jackson pointed them toward the betting floor. The scene beyond was chaos, though it operated under its own strange rhythm. People leaned over counters and barked numbers, shouted fighter names, and waved slips of parchment in the air. The arena's gauntlet was a hot topic, with bets shifting constantly, while a separate board listed odds for the champion match, and a bold question mark in place of the challengers. They walked straight to the counter and handed over their wager, every remaining coin. The betting attendant took their arena sign-in sheet as verification, scanning it briefly before her expression shifted. Without asking permission, she raised her voice above the crowd and declared that the champion had been challenged, that the games were on. The room exploded with cheers and curses collided as gamblers scrambled to update their wagers, runners dashed off to update betting boards, and more than one person shouted something about finally seeing someone gutsy enough to take the fight. The attendant turned back and asked for their name. Not their names, she interrupted. As they introduced themselves, she wanted their group name. There was a pause, as the adventurers had never considered what to call themselves, if anything at all. After a moment of collective thinking, someone said it. The Heckfire Club. The attendant raised an eyebrow, and it perhaps hovered there for a beat too long. She nodded, barely, and instead wrote, "Worthy challengers" on the board. The crowd didn't care, and the bets were coming in. They were handed their bet markers and ushered toward the exit, now part of the evening's programme. As they left, they exchanged quiet glances. None of them had told the casino attendant they were from the arena, and yet the sign-in sheet had already been understood, processed, and announced. Another reminder, plain as day now, that everything down here was connected. Every place led to the next, and every sticky-fingered hand fed another. And as they stepped out into the thunder of a packed arena crowd, they knew this wasn't just about fighting anymore. This was about playing the game. They followed the signs back to the Broken Chains main hall. Marlin was waiting for them, sweating again, though this time it was unclear whether from nerves or just anticipation. He ushered them down the stone hallway into the challengers' hall, a quiet space built of old stone and cold benches, with thick walls that barely muffled the roar of the growing crowd above. He bade them wait and make their final preparations, putting an uncomfortable emphasis on the word final. Before anyone could ask what that was supposed to mean, the door at the far end of the room slammed open with theatrical precision. Ulma Irontooth strode in like she owned the place, because she did. She went through the rules again, quickly but clearly, enter the ring, survive the round, maybe win, probably die, possibly yield. She wasn't sure yet. They seemed sturdy enough, at least durable. Then, without warning, her tone shifted. She told them that if they fell, they'd fall as challengers, and in her arena, that meant something. Every blood-soaked inch of the pit, every scream and cheer was part of a performance she considered sacred. Bloodsport, she said, wasn't a slaughter. It was the truest art form. She nodded once, earnest and wordless, wishing them good fortune, the kind that kept bones whole and names remembered. Just before leaving, she paused in the doorway, eyes fixed forward, voice quieter now. She told them the crowd loved a good show, whether it ended in victory, yield, or something with more screaming. And if the show was good enough, if it stirred something deep in those tired onlookers, they might even earn boons. Not from the gods, but from the crowd. Most of them were working people. Scarred palms, cracked nails. They spent their gold and short time away from daily toil very carefully. When they spent either of those here, she said, they wanted to feel something. Ulma didn't wait for a reply. She yelled, loud enough for the floor to tremble, for Marlin to fetch the thaumaturgy stone, or whatever it's called, because it was time to warm up the crowd. The door closed behind her and the noise from above returned. The party was alone now, despite the roar of thousands of voices waiting for a show, and the long stretch of quiet before it began. Drums started beating, and the voice of Ulma could be heard, if muffled, through the thick stone and iron door before them. A final concussive slam of the drums signalled the start, and the massive gates flung open. From the other side of the heavy door, Ulma's voice could be heard rising through the stone, carried by some arcane amplification that filled the chamber above with raw force. She was working the crowd, stirring them into a frenzy with practiced bellowing and declarations only someone like her could make sound like gospel. The response was immediate. Cheers echoed through the walls, and the pounding of feet and fists rolled like thunder from above. The party stepped forward as the doors groaned open, and a wall of light poured through the gap, momentarily blinding them. Heat followed, warmth from thousands of bodies packed into the arena, and then sound. Raw, unfiltered, and deafening. The crowd wasn't just loud, they were ready. They moved into the glare slowly, eyes adjusting as the noise continued to swell. Drums pounded in time with the rising cheers, and the stands stretched high into the cavern ceiling, packed with revellers and gamblers shouting over one another. Ulma's voice faltered for a beat, not enough for the crowd to notice, but just long enough for those standing in the gate to hear her shout something unintelligible, clearly directed at Marlin. There was a pause, then Marlin's voice filtered back faintly, just audible through the noise. He said the name, the Heckfire Club, the one they'd given at the casino. Perhaps Ulma did not take to it, perhaps the crowd was too loud. Or through a mixture of both, she repeated back that the Egg Friar's Hub sounded more like a kitchen accident. Another pause, back with the full weight of her amplified voice declaring the crowd welcome, from all corners of the world, the deadly, the amazing blood bank. The crowd roared and cheers unchained resonated the very sand the adventurers stood upon. Friz adjusted the grip on her staff, resisting the urge to check her spellbook one more time. She'd already committed the layout of the arena to memory, calculated the effective radius of fireball, and mentally pre-sorted her reaction spells by utility and flair. Zora rolled his shoulders with the kind of energy reserved for people who looked forward to getting hit. The crowd noise was fueling something primal, and he quietly considered whether this counted as a festival. He wasn't afraid, and let the wild magic surge in him. His eyes seemed to refocus in that very moment as the rooster juice was wearing off, and wondered just what in the 7 hells he had agreed to. Thomas patted down his coat, counting hidden pockets, secret coin stash, backup dagger, backup dagger, and his deck of cards. He wondered if the challengers had loot they could keep, and somewhere in the back of his mind he asked himself if signing up for Bloodsport counted as protecting Zora. Celia took a deep breath, centre of balance even, eyes half-lidded in focus. She didn't fear the fight, she feared being the one forced to end it, again. Violence came easy, restraint took work. She was focusing, channeling the kinetic energy for the fight to come. Move in, strike sharp, and protect your friends, thought Celia. She wasn't above cracking a rib or two, though. Zyrrath simply stood still, back straight, eyes forward. He had made peace with the gods long ago, though if they chose to abandon him now, that would be unfortunate. For everyone else. He adjusted his armour slightly and took stock of where he had come. May the gods remember his name, he thought, as he remembered his home. The door shut behind the party with a heavy finality, and under the dancing lights of the broken chain arena, the Heckfire Club readied for battle. Ulma's voice surged through the arena, ringing from every enchanted stone and resonating in the hearts of the 1,000-strong crowd above. She welcomed the hard-working men and women of Tanner Town, farmers, mill hands, cattle folk, traders, and tavern keepers. And, with equal measure, the rest of the province that had come to wager coin on chaos. This first round, she declared, would be dedicated to them. Her cheer rolled across the stands like a wave cresting, and she announced the challenge: return the little piggies to their pen. The crowd cheered louder, the adventurers blinked, eyeing one another. She clarified firmly that the little piggies could not be killed, harmed, or injured. No magic missiles, no sharp edges, no fireballs. They had 3 minutes to get every last one of them back in their pen, or they'd be disqualified. Ulma let the announcement hang in the air for half a breath before bellowing, "Let the mayhem begin." Iron grates clanged open at the base of the arena floor, and 6 greased-up goblins exploded into the pit, green and slippery. Their skin shimmered under the arena lights, oiled and shiny, and their feet moved far faster than seemed fair. In the centre of the pit, a steel-gated pen rose from below, complete with hay, latches, and a grate. A fast, twitchy lute riff burst to life over the arena's thaumaturgic amplifiers. The goblins giggled wildly as they scattered. Celia was the first to move. She was fast, very fast, and managed to cut off one of the goblins with a precision that drew a genuine gasp from the stands. Her body moved like a shadow, and her grip locked tight. Zora, Thomas, and Zyrrath tried to follow, but they had 2 problems. 1, the goblins were incredibly fast, and 2, they were greased like roast chickens. Zora made a solid lunge, but ended up hugging the ground instead of his target. Thomas nearly caught one, only for it to bounce off a wall and bolt between his legs. Zyrrath grabbed one by the arm, only to find his grip slip with an audible squelch. Frizz, watching her companions fumble, took a measured breath and waited for just the right moment to cast a sleep spell. 3 of the goblins dropped mid-run, face first into the sand, snoring and drooling into the dust. The crowd loved it. Ulma's voice cut in overhead, applauding the display, goading the crowd with calls of "a real-life wizard." Frizz wasn't sure what part of her spell book had prepared her for roaring applause, but she found herself smiling despite herself. They moved fast, dragging the unconscious goblins by limbs and heels toward the pen, and tossed them over the side where they landed in a tangled pile of straw and limbs. The other 3 were still moving. Zora closed in on one, arms wide, only for the goblin to produce a tiny wooden club and bring it down on his shin. Zora let out a growl that likely registered as seismic on the other side of the arena. The goblin slipped past but didn't get far. Fueled by rage and spite, Zora grabbed the creature mid-leap by the ankle and yanked him from the air. Ulma's commentary followed, amused and sharp that the large fellow just got him. Elsewhere, Thomas and Celia managed to flank another. It involved a low sweep, some light bruising, and one of them getting bitten, not seriously, but they wrestled the goblin into submission and shoved him into the pen with far less ceremony than the others. That left one scurrying goblin, and the paladin was on the move. Zyrrath waited as the goblin darted left, then right, then made a break for the edge. The paladin turned sharply on his heel, timing the movement with exact precision, and snatched the goblin by the back of the neck like a sack of laundry. The goblin's eyes widened, managed a weak "uh-oh" before being slammed into the latchgate and the straw landing below. The crowd roared, and Ulma's voice returned, triumphant and booming. She congratulated the contestants, declaring round 1 complete. Then she called for silence. The noise dropped immediately, and all that remained was the sound of heavy breathing. 5 adventurers catching their breath, the rustle of straw in the pen, and the faint sound of a lute being restrung. The crowd, so wild only moments before, fell into a reverent hush. Ulma's voice returned, quieter now but no less commanding. She said it was time for reflection, for prayer, for the challengers who stood bloodied in the pit, and for those who had once stood where they stood now and had not walked away. No one cheered, no one clapped. Even the crowd from the upper tiers, who moments earlier had been throwing chestnuts and laughing over odds, bowed their heads. Ulma welcomed a figure to the parapet above the arena, a man dressed in layered robes of purple and black, adorned with symbols of faith from 24 religions and unidentifiable cults. She introduced him as Brother Malkesh of the Altar of the Unbound. Thomas leaned closer to the group, lips curled into a half-smile. Without needing to raise his voice, he simply noted that it seemed Brother Malkesh had found them first. The brother approached slowly, head bowed, arms lifted gently as if addressing something no one else could see. He muttered in a tone that was almost too soft for the thaumaturgic amplification to catch. Incense burned around his feet, curling upward into the arena's light. Celia looked sideways toward Frizz and asked what exactly the man was praying for. Frizz didn't answer immediately, and her colour had drained. Her grip on her staff had tightened. When she finally spoke, it was quiet. They, she said, were about to find out. Limbs tore free from the arena sands, arms clad in ancient armour, swords still strapped to skeletal backs, helmets twisted by rust and rot. 6 corpses pulled themselves upright, drawing rusted weapons. From above, Ulma's voice returned, bidding all to pay respects to the fallen challengers and heroes with one final round of glory. The crowd exploded with gasps, applause and cheer. The excitement was palpable. The adventurers moved, instinctively falling into formation. Blades were drawn, spells prepared. The dead were circling now, creaking bones and hollow gazes locked on the living. We end our tale today with our adventures encircled by champions past, returned to existence by the Brother Malkesh. Until next time, fellow adventurers.
Interest.